Hello, and welcome to episode 125 of Public Interest Podcast with your host, Jordan Cooper, where we interview politicians, activists, advocates, and others who seek to improve the state of the world. We're here today with Amanda Bennett, director of The Voice of America, former editor-in-chief of the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Lexington Herald-Leader, and an editor of the Oregonian and Bloomberg News. She is a former journalist and bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal. Amanda is the winner of the Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting in 1997 and again in 2001 for public service, which she shared with her Oregonian and Wall Street Journal colleagues. Amanda is the former co-chair of the Pulitzer Prize Board. She's also the co-founder of the Dream.us to provide college scholarships to children of undocumented immigrants in the United States, and is additionally an author of 6 books. Amanda, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Jordan. Thank you for asking me.
Excellent. The first question I'd like to pose to you is, what are you currently doing, or what have you ever done to advance the public interest, and why?
Well, I think simply being the director of Voice of America is advancing the public interest because, first off, I am passionate in my belief about a full, fair, and independent press. I think an independent press, maintaining that and maintaining its fairness is incredibly important for the entire world. It's what I've spent my entire life doing. And this is even more important because we're also exporting the benefits of a free press all around the world. So I think that mission in and of itself makes the world a better place.
Is there anything unique about the free press in the United States, or anything pertaining to the First Amendment, or is media different in America than in other markets to which you export the Voice of America?
Well, we broadcast in radio, TV, internet, video, podcasts, any way that people get their news and information, we do that. And so, but we do it into countries that are generally the countries that would be called not free. They have either no or a very limited free press. So the things that we are able to do, the fact that we are able to report both sides of a story, the fact that we are able to check things factually and make facts, not opinions, the basis of our reporting, is actually, I wouldn't say unique in the world, but it's certainly very different to the conditions that apply in most of the countries where we're working.
So in some of those countries, in many of those countries, the Voice of America would not be welcomed. In the beginning of Voice of America, in fact, the Soviet Union used to sometimes jam the signal of Voice of America. Why is a free press so important that you're willing to go against what the desires of those governments, that you're willing to work hard to try to go around obstacles and difficulties that are presented in trying to get Voice of America out to listeners in those countries?
Well, as I say, the idea that a citizenry should have access to both sides of a story, to be able to judge based on facts, and not to have one particular narrative take dominance over another particular narrative. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that's what Voice of America has been practicing for many, many years, and that's the type of journalism I grew up in. And I think that even though many countries do block us, they do try and keep us out, they limit our access, that it's really important for people to have choices in what they hear, view, and listen to.
Would all of those oppressive governments agree that you're a fair, unbiased news organization that presents just the facts?
I would say that would not necessarily be the case. For example, we are routinely denounced by the North Korean President Kim Jong-un, and he routinely denounces what we do. That says to me that we are actually reaching his citizens and him. He couldn't denounce us if he didn't hear us.
So why would leaders of those oppressive governments, why would they not want Voice of America in there? Why would they? What is the alternative? What is the threat posed by free press?
Well, if you think about it, whenever there is a government attempting to keep control over its people, mm-hmm. one of the first things they do is they try and control the media, because if they control the story, then they can adjust things according to that story, and they don't have to be bothered by inconvenient facts that get in the way of what that story is. So that's why providing people the actual information about what's going on, we don't attempt to change the political direction people are taking. We're simply offering people a realistic view of what's actually going on.
Interesting. So even dictators who derive their power from people to some extent, and that they want the people to believe a certain narrative about them, and if they were to embrace a separate narrative, then perhaps their leader's grip on power might weaken.
That's sort of not my job. That's not what I'm thinking about. I'm not thinking about what's happening to a leader. I'm not thinking about which faction is going to be in power someplace. What I'm thinking about is all the journalists I've got around the world who are putting themselves in harm's way to try and find out exactly what is going on. It's up to the people of that country to decide what they want to do with the information. We just want to make sure they have the information. So the political outcome of what we're doing is not really our concern.
So let's go back to the beginning of your story, Amanda. You've been a reporter for decades, before you were able to assume some of the titles that I enumerated earlier. What is it that originally attracted you to journalism? What is it that inspired you to try to get the facts out to the people?
So I made a claim last week in a speech that I've had a 50-year journalistic career, and one of my colleagues, thank goodness, came up and asked me and said, "That's not possible. How could it have been 50 years?" I had my first story published in a newspaper when I was 11, and the idea that I could write, that I could express myself, that people would read it, that people would care about, that I could help them see something that they didn't know about originally. I mean, I've really hardly looked back from that.
So it was first, what gave you the idea when you're 11 years old? Not many 11-year-olds are writing letters to the editor of local newspapers.
It wasn't even a letter to the editor, it was an actual story. So I had a very interesting family circumstance that I wrote about, and it was I could tell that people read it because I got lots of feedback.
So you developed your career as a reporter in the Wall Street Journal. Was that an interest in finance, or is it just a job that you ended up landing?
No, as a matter of fact, I had no interest in finance whatsoever, and when they offered me the job, I had to seriously think about whether or not I was going to take it because I thought finance was boring and I didn't know anything about that world. But honestly, the Wall Street Journal, I started in the Wall Street Journal in 1975, and those years from 1975 into the 2000s were probably the very best journalistic training ground in the entire world. The diaspora from the Wall Street Journal of those years has spread across the United States and across the world, and you'll find journalistic leaders in major news organizations, all of whom were trained during that period of time.
What made it such a fertile ground for young journalists?
The first thing was they were willing to hire young journalists, and they didn't want people who had already been trained up in something else. So they hired me essentially right out of college. The second thing is they maintained that finance business was interesting and that there were stories everywhere. That basic idea that you can find interesting stories in any field, that was a basic one. But most of all, there was the very, very disciplined approach to writing and the very disciplined approach to thinking. That was where we were all steeped in the idea that there was a true narrative, and your stories that you were writing had to be completely factually based. You had to, and it used to be a joke in those days that you would report, and 95% of what you report and wrote was going to wind up on the cutting room floor. It was never going to see the light of day.
How that made you feel?
It first off, when I was much younger, it was like, oh, this is so frustrating, because when I look at all my friends, they're doing all this work and they've got 100 stories, and I just get one. But after a while, you realized that the reason you're doing that is because your first impression of something is not always the most valid. You need to hold things up to the light and look at lots of different aspects of it, and in order to make sure something is true. For example, if somebody says something, they say, this is the biggest or the largest or the smallest, or this is the first time or something like that. You can't necessarily know that that's true unless you go out and report that out and make sure you know what's going on.
So is it fair to say that the Wall Street Journal instilled in you a healthy sense of skepticism?
It instilled in me a very robust sense of skepticism, but I think that word healthy is not a bad idea because it wasn't a cynicism. It was a skepticism. It was simply that you had to examine everything that you read or heard, and you also had to, before you could go out and report on any particular premise, you had to have done enough work to persuade a higher editor that there was possibly a valid story here. You couldn't just go out and say they're tearing down this forest, or they're doing this, or they're harming the environment, or they're harming this. You had to do enough reporting to say, is that premise actually a fact, or is that just my gut impression? And you couldn't even go out and start reporting until you had done that work.
So if you have a first impression, how do you proceed? In that example, I don't know if that was an example of an actual story, but if you could use an example from an actual story of having a first gut reaction and then having that evolve into an actual factual story, how do you evolve from that?
I'll give you an example. One of my favorite stories I did many years ago when I was very, very early in my career. There is a street in Detroit that back then was known. It divided a very wealthy community from an extremely poor community. Mm-hmm. And it was called Alter Road. And so it was named in a way that you could say. And so during the automobile crisis in Detroit, there was really an accentuated view of like the clash between rich and poor. So I thought, why don't I do a story about the people on the rich side and the people on the poor side, and what's it like to be touching each other. Mm-hmm. But first off, I had to make sure that they actually, even though it visually looked to me like that, they actually were, one side was richer and one side was poor, and I had to get stuff. So before I even went out to do any interviewing, I got all the real estate records on both sides of the line, one on one side, one on the other. I got all the demographics of one side and demographics on the other side, demographic information from the city. I followed a postman and watched what the postman was delivering to one side and the other and see what kind of things were happening. So I basically, before I even went out to actually conduct interviews on either side, mm-hmm. I had amassed, a huge dossier of information that said to me, this is what the average income is on this side. This is what the average house price is. Mm-hmm. This is where they go to school. This mm-hmm. is what their kind of racial and ethnic makeup is. Over here, it was the same thing.
And was your hypothesis validated?
My hypothesis was of course validated, but it also not just validated my hypothesis, but it also gave me a very rich vein of reporting, so I knew where to go and look for.
How many articles were the result of all that effort?
One.
And how long did you spend on that whole effort?
Well, back then, when you were in the Wall Street Journal, you had these daily duties you had to do. You had to basically go to earnings conferences and dividend reports and go to meetings and talk to people about that. So you had to do daily duties, mm-hmm. and then you got a certain time off to work on these bigger things. So when I tell you it probably took me 2 months to do that.
It was in your time in between.
It was in my time in between the doing actual jobs, but you were expected to do these bigger stories.
You were working on multiple stories at the same time.
Correct.
But you had prior approval from your editor not to write the story, but to begin investigating, right. which may lead to a dead end.
Right, correct.
So is that still the case today, where large news organizations are still investing in long-term investigative journalism?
I think that yes, they are, and there are organizations that are supporting that kind of journalism. There's news organizations that are very passionate about it. Mm-hmm. I think it is also fair to say that level of time and care and attention and dedicated to a fact-based, not just reporting, but a fact-based selection of your point of view mm-hmm. is going to, it has been declining quite a bit.
I want to talk for a moment about the word trust. Mm-hmm. It sounds like a great deal of the effort expended in your career has been in trying to ensure that the stories you report are actually factually based. And so that implies that readers would therefore trust your reporting to be factually based. Could you speak about the nature of the relationship between the media consumers and the media producers, and where fact fits in there with that trust?
Well, the first thing was not just that the story is actually factually based, but your hypothesis also has to be factually based, because you can have a story that's completely accurate factually, mm-hmm. but your hypothesis is wrong. I mean, you could say that I've got this rocket up here and it's pointed straight up and it's got this much thrust and it's got this thing and it's going to go to the moon, or it's going to go into the next field. Mm-hmm. So your hypothesis has to be correct, that you know what the basic idea is. And not just attention to specific facts that you're using to prove your hypothesis. So both things have to be correct. In terms of trust, one of the places where we articulated that was at the Oregonian, which was a very special mid-sized regional paper, which was in the was in Oregon, served the entire state of Oregon, and the editor there, Sandra Mims Rowe, was one of the great editors of the United States. She used the word credibility. She said, if we don't have credibility, we've got nothing. We need to be credible to our readers. They may not like us, they may not like what we write, they may not agree with what we write, but we have to be presenting reality as it is.
So how is it that so I'd like to transition into the Pulitzer Prize. You clearly, it's from Joseph Pulitzer, it's from the 19th century, it's awarded to excellence in journalism. And you've been part of teams that have received it at two separate occasions in your life. Why did they award that to you? And now that you're on, let's start there. Why were those prizes awarded to you, and what did it signify to you? What did it mean to you? Did it change anything in your life?
It changed something in my life in that I was so extremely proud to have been part of those teams. And both places where I shared the Pulitzer with a team of journalists, in one case as a reporter sharing it with other reporters, and the other as the leader of the team that created this body of work, our motto was that we do Pulitzer-worthy work, not Pulitzer work. You don't aim to win the prize, because if you aim to win the prize, it's going to distort your thinking. You're going to do things in order to try and impress people. You're going to try to be flashy. Our goal was not to try to win the prize, but to try and do such excellent work that it would be worthy to win the prize. And I can remember finishing the project in Oregon, and us looking at each other and saying, it'd be certainly great, it'd make us feel great if we won the Pulitzer, but you know what, we are so happy that we did this, because we used our very highest standards, and we think we actually achieved it. We actually did what we set out to do, and it's always nice to win a prize, but honestly, if we'd won the prize and hadn't had that feeling that we had done everything right and had done everything to win, I don't think it would have meant as much.
Was anything different in a newsroom after the awarding of the prize?
Well, all newsrooms get really super excited about winning the Pulitzer Prize. I'm sure you've seen the pictures on the web and things of people popping champagne in the newsroom and things like that. And everybody, feels very proud of their colleagues. So it's nice to win it yourself, but it's also nice to feel proud of your colleagues for winning it.
Now, you also have a unique experience, or rather, perhaps a rare experience of having won it twice. And not only did you win it twice, but you once won it for national reporting and once for public service. Was it different the second time around than the first?
Well, in both cases, remember, I was sharing this prize. So in the first one, I was part of a team of journalists who were each working on their individual stories and came together as a group. In the second one, I was the leader of a project that had many people and many moving parts. So in one, I was actually out there working and doing the reporting and the writing and things. In the other one, I was directing the work of other people. So from my perspective, it was very different.
So I hear you emphasizing the work of the team and the intrinsic value of the products that you created. And it sounds like the prize was just icing on top of the cake.
Well, that's the way I feel, and I think that's the way most of my colleagues felt back then. I can't vouch for right now, but I certainly think that the value of what we did was really the thing that we took pride in.
And now that you've sat on the Pulitzer Prize board and you've been the co-chair, what metrics did you use to select other winners, or do you have any unique stories from your time on the board that?
Well, honestly, having been on the Pulitzer board for 10 years and the co-chair for one, I have to say that experience made me wonder how in the world I had ever gotten to be able to win this prize, because the quality of things that we saw was so stunningly awesome. The quality of thinking that went into it, sometimes the amount of danger that people went through, the amount of work people did, the sheer creativity that people used. I mean, over the 10 years, you can imagine, I saw a ton of work, and a lot of it was really, really awe-inspiringly great.
Interesting that the higher the heights that you reached, the more humility. It sounds like was inspired. It sounds like you had a great deal of humility by being exposed to the work of others in your field.
Gosh, I really hope so. I hope that's what you hear because I think that's a really key personal attribute, and I thank you for observing that, but I hope it's true.
So, but you're not limited only to journalism. You are the co-founder of the Dream.us.
I'm not unfortunately, but I was very glad to have been involved with my husband in co-founding that. But now, back when I was not in a journalistic field,
right.
Now that I'm back in a journalistic field, I have severed myself from that operation, so I can't be involved in it anymore. I'm separate from that. I was very proud of it back then. My husband is now doing it, but I don't have any involvement with it anymore.
I see. So, but it's something that was important to you at the time?
It was something that I was very proud of being involved in.
Huh. Well, it's certainly admirable to help kids get college scholarships. So now, as a director of the Voice of America and having been editors of various newspapers, I guess, what are you trying to accomplish as director of Voice of America? Is there any difference between your reign here as editor or the previous editor here at Voice of America? What is distinctive about your leadership style and the direction of the organization today?
Well, I think we all tried to do exactly the same thing, and that is, we first off want to support our journalists, because our journalists are in some ways unique among journalists in the world. There's only a couple other news organizations that have this structure. A lot of our journalists are working in very difficult, very dangerous, both political situations and physical situations. A lot of our journalists are just in the course of doing their daily work, putting themselves in some kind of harm's way. So the first thing is to make sure that we're setting up structures and systems and paying attention to things that will keep our journalists safe and enable them to do the best work they can. So that's one thing I think we're all doing.
Trying to ensure security for all of your reporters. Are your reporters being targeted in dangerous situations, or does they just merely happen to be in a war zone reporting on the conflict?
Both, and along with our colleagues, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, Radio Sawa, we basically cover a lot of that world. And so all of us have colleagues that are both, operating in war zones and also being or having been personally targeted.
Interesting. Do you feel as though that many of the individuals who work for Voice of America feel as though there's a moral duty to ensure that an accurate story is disseminated and that real news is disseminated to people around the world, or does that not resonate?
When people ask me what surprised me about coming to Voice of America, it was the extent to which being here reconfirmed my commitment to journalism, because I saw the extent to which, and I still see every day, the extent to which people are putting themselves in danger because they believe that the only way their home countries or other home countries that they know about can actually hopefully extricate themselves from the terrible, the wartime predicaments or the terrorist predicaments or various things. They are very committed to the use of free, full, independent information back to their home countries. I find it extremely inspiring.
Have you ever received feedback throughout the course of your career about, for instance, from individuals? So in Kosovo in the 1990s, obviously there was a lot of conflict, and now it's a peaceful region of the world. Did those individuals ever tell about how Voice of America gave them hope while they were in the war? Do you have any stories along that line?
Going back to World War II, the people who are still alive then would say, they use words like the Voice of America was a beacon of hope. It was a place where we knew there was a world that could be different. That's part of this is the Voice of America's 75th anniversary, and so we are very actively seeking that feedback, to going back to people and saying, tell me what Voice of America meant to you over the years. And we do get some really interesting stories about how people depended on the Voice of America, and today depend on the Voice of America, and say, it's important for us to have a source of news and information that we can trust.
So as we approach the end of this podcast, I'd like to ask you a final question, which is to reflect upon your years in public service within the field of journalism and without it. Do you have some experience in philanthropy? And speak about what it is that has motivated you. You've spoken about the desire to get a story out there, starting at 11 years old with just being able to tell a story and be heard. Can you talk a little bit about your motivations and then what you hope at the end of your career will have been your legacy? What has happened in this world because you've been here? What are you leaving behind? What are you building, and why were you motivated to build it?
So my time in actual public service, in the sense of government public service, has been very short. I've been in this job for less than a year. It's the only government experience I've ever had. I've had, as I say, almost 50 years experience in the private media sector. And so in both cases, I think it's exactly the same thing, is really understanding, often not at an intellectual level, but a visceral level, how important it is to get out there and tell stories, but to tell stories that people can trust. And I think I've seen the power of that information. I've seen it, the power of it to change lives. I've seen it the power to change policy. I've seen it the power. But again, I'm not setting out to do any of those things. I'm setting out to provide tools to people so that they can trust what they read, see, or hear. And, you know, in my legacy, I hope the one thing that people will remember me for, both in my personal life and my professional life, is integrity. I always want to try and think through in the best way I can, knowing that human beings are flawed, knowing that human beings, you know, are always subject to making mistakes and things, but I hope I will look back on my career and believe that I've always done things with integrity, that I've tried to do the right thing in any situation I find myself in.
I do have one final question, which is, there's a phrase called, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. It sounds like a lot of the role that you've had in the press is to present tools, as you described it, to the electorate, and hopefully they can use that to hold powers accountable, improve the health of democracy. But sometimes, you know, what are the challenges? How have you reacted? You can't force people to consume your content, right? You're producing the tools, but what if people don't use those tools? Does that ever concern you?
I'm way more optimistic than most people about the number of people out there who do want to drink. Mm-hmm. And it's those people I want to reach, and hopefully the people who don't will at some point decide that they want to, or they'll find what they're looking for some other way. But I am not as pessimistic as other people are about the value of truth in journalism. I think that there is a huge number of people who do recognize truth, who want truth, and who believe in it when they see it.
And that has been Amanda Bennett, the director of the Voice of America, former editor-in-chief of the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Lexington Herald-Leader, an editor of the Oregonian and the Bloomberg News, a former journalist and bureau chief with the Wall Street Journal, a winner of the Pulitzer Prize for national reporting in 1997 and 2001 for public service, which she shared with her Oregonian and Wall Street colleagues, former co-chair of the Pulitzer Prize Board, co-founder of the Dream.us, and author of 6 books. Amanda speaks about attempting to live her life of public service with integrity, with humility, to really provide a public service to people, whether she's in the public sector. For most of her career, she has not been in the public sector, or in the private sector, where she's trying to present to people, whether they be shareholders, citizens, whatever identity they have, to provide the correct information to people so that they can make their own decisions. She's empowering choice, decisions, and she is respecting her audience as an audience that can make their own decisions if they're only provided with accurate information. She believes that people thirst for fact and the real stories, and in fact, as she has led different news organizations, she has tried to emphasize that those organizations must maintain credibility and must inspire trust in the stories they produce in their audience by providing real, well-balanced, unbiased, as objective as possible stories. And for Amanda, public service is simply enabling people to get the facts and make a good decision And that is what makes the world a better place. So Amanda, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed this.
And this has been episode 125 of Public Interest Podcast with your host, Jordan Cooper, where we interview politicians, activists, advocates, and others who seek to improve the state of the world. Remember to subscribe on publicinterestpodcast.com, listen on iTunes or your podcast app on Apple products, and should you wish to communicate with Amanda, you can leave her a voicemail with the phone number listed on the Contact Us page of the website. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll talk to you next time.